Yes, I'm here to talk about my book because it's highly relevant to the theme of this meeting. So the title is not of my making, but there is quite a lot about Barbie in the book and in the talk. So for those of you who were here yesterday, some of what I say will sort of build on some of the comments made yesterday. I apologize if it's repetitive. My slides were loaded last week, so I couldn't really change them. So, Barbie, yes. So, math class is tough was an infamous phrase that was added to Barbie's voice box along with various others, like, who have you got a crush on, and things like that, back in 1992. And it caused, even then, it caused quite a lot of fury, shall I say, amongst those people who thought girls should not be discouraged from doing subjects like maths. And I should say, my book is called Why We Need More Women in Science, but for me, that is STEM. So if you're an engineer, if you're a computer scientist, or an aspiring engineer and computer scientist, or mathematician, it's still for you. So the idea that young girls, what age play with Barbies, 5, 6, are put off maths is hardly encouraging. That was 1992. You might have thought the world had moved on. This was 2010, when, hey, Barbie was like to be a computer engineer. And that sounds really positive until you actually looked at the story. And so here's some little bits from it. I'm designing a game that shows kids how computers work. But I'm only creating the design ideas. She's not really doing computing. She's doing arty things, because that's what Barbies do, isn't it? And she gets a computer virus and crashed her laptop. I mean, really, is this a good role model for young girls thinking computing is the future? And in the end, the boys have to step in. Step aside, Barbie, you've broken enough now. I mean, it just beggars belief, doesn't it? That this is a book that's put out there to encourage girls to go into computing, and yet this is the story. And it took 4 years before that one was pulled. I think the Math Class is Tough was actually pulled quite faster. And here's an alternative version. So this is feminist hacker Barbie, which sort of was, you know, why don't you write your own story about how girls can do computing? So Barbie has an image problem when it comes to doing these kinds of STEM areas. And I think this is absolutely symptomatic of our society, that right, I believe, from birth, we worry that there are girl subjects and there are boy subjects. And girls are dressed in pink, of course, pink. And, you know, it's just so frustrating, which is why I ended up writing this book. And the reality is, because of what happens in the earliest years, I think girls consistently receive this message that STEM subjects are not for them. They're not told you can't do it. It's nothing as blanket as that. You know, we have moved on from the Victorian era, but we have these stereotypes. So that Jocelyn showed this identical slide yesterday. Apologies. These are actually TV ads from 2015. And you can see that boys are encouraged to do battle and use power, and girls are expected to rely on magic and be beautiful. Now, really, in the world today, how far is magic going to get you? I'm sorry, we're not all alchemists now. So we have a problem when this is what is going on. Now, Let Toys Be Toys, who pulled this together, claimed in 2021 that things had moved on, but I'm not convinced. It's still love and magic for the girls, a bit of glitter too. And the boys are expected to battle and race. And I don't actually think battle is a very good message for boys either. That's a different story. But we segregate things so much. And then we have this kind of thing for sale. I wanted Brown Cox in one of those, but I haven't managed that yet. But the trouble is, if you go and try and buy baby grows for a newborn, they are already distinguished. I mean, that must be for the parents' benefit, because the kid's not going to care, is it, at 3 days old, if it's put in a dinosaur baby grow or a something with a I don't know, battle, Jedi warrior or something. So we have these problems, and the stereotypes persist. And so it seems to me that we can talk about what universities can do, and I'll come on to that. But we start with problems in our society all the way through. And it is really hard to change that because it is a societal thing. I sneakily put something on Grandsnet about my book and the difficulty of buying gender-neutral toys for my granddaughters. And nearly all the comments came back, well, boys will be boys. And you think, no, you're imposing what a boy is, what masculinity is, and that leads to its own problems. So what can be done and by whom, and what can you yourself do? Because we can all do something, and I'll come back to that right at the end. So the media, yes, I don't know how many journalists we have in the audience, but they have a role to play because they persist in using these stereotypes as shortcuts. Stereotypes are useful, but... So this is an article in the Telegraph from 2015. My daughter shouldn't have to study science. So too many girls are pressurised into taking STEM subjects just to appease feminists. Now, I'm not very happy with that as a headline. And she goes on to say, this focus on STEM subjects sends a message that makes her and me, her daughter was, I think, 14 at the time, uncomfortable. Doing a man's work is more impressive than doing a woman's. And this is being propagated in mainstream media. How do we change that? I mean, the journalists, the media have a huge role to play in changing cultural expectations. The idea that a 14-year-old girl should not understand why a vaccination might be a good idea or what climate change is all about. It's about democracy as much as anything. And yet she's saying it's to appease feminists and implying that being a journalist is a suitable role for a woman and being a scientist is not. And we have problems in our schools. So when my son was 11, 12, his English teacher said to me, well, boys can't write. And what she meant was my son couldn't write at that point, which is fair enough. He spent all his life reading football reports on CFAX, if those of you old enough in the audience to remember that. And his writing style was definitely CFAX. But, you know, by the time he's in his 30s, he's brilliant. The idea that you can write off 50% of the population, it's just horrendous. It cuts both ways. So, expectations, again, what is in the media? We had the hard-hatted engineer yesterday. Well, I think too often if you Google scientists, that's what you get. Sort of manic, definitely involving test tubes and white lab coats. I was brought up with a manic Peter Sellers in Dr. Strangelove. It's generational, probably doesn't mean a great deal to you. But, you know, the scientists we see repeatedly, he's not in that T-shirt, you know, they are nice white men. And we don't portray the alternatives. So, can you name a woman scientist? Well, in this room, I'm sure you can. I mean, here's Jocelyn. So, the reality is that most of the British public can't. And I think this is pretty damning, but perhaps not surprising. So, about half the population could name a male scientist. Well, that's pretty bad too, isn't it? You would have thought most people would be able to name a male scientist. But certainly they can't name females. And when I go into schools, I tend to use this, and most schools will have no one who recognises most of these people. Now, as was said yesterday, I don't think Marie Curie is a good role model for women, and I go into that in the book, but she is famous, and if you need to know a female scientist, can we please remember Marie Curie, even if it's only because you buy a daffodil once a year for cancer research. Rosalind Franklin, Churchill College is very proud to have her papers. So, you know, we are trying to build up a collection in our archives of women scientists. Jocelyn. And I thought this one would resonate more with school children, but no. This is Hannah Fry, frequently on the screens, very photogenic. But no, they don't know her either. So I'm now going to play some clips from the inquiry that Dorothy mentioned yesterday. The appallingly awful things that Catherine Barbelsing said at this. So this is Greg Clark, who's chair of the Select Committee, doing an inquiry into diversity and inclusion in STEM.
That, you know, in a good school, with an outstanding school, with excellent teachers, girls are not choosing at least physics in the same proportion as boys might. What might be the reasons for that?
Well, like I say, I just think they don't like it. There's a lot of hard maths in there that I think that they would rather not do, and that's not to say that there isn't hard stuff to do in biology and chemistry. There is, but it's not.
Why would girls not want to do hard maths any more than boys?
The research generally, people, they say that's just a natural thing. I mean, I don't know. I can't say. I'm not an expert at that sort of thing, but. That's what people. That's what they say. I mean, I don't think that there's anything external when it comes to our kids. I don't think they're being taught very well. They are doing well at GCSE, and they choose the subjects that they want to do. We're certainly not out there campaigning for more girls to do physics.
I'll stop it there. And, I think she rather made a fool of herself at that point. She was quoting evidence without actually knowing it. And one can deconstruct it. We had a discussion yesterday about this idea, girls don't like hard maths, rubbish. She claims it's evidence. She obviously has never looked at the evidence. She's never thought about it. And in a way, that's what I find most distressing. She's just taking stereotypes and running with it without actually thinking about it. Remember, this is a woman who is, got a huge reputation as head of a really good school. But if you look at her school statistics, the number of girls who progress to do physics A-level is 16%, which is way below the national average of 23%. And given everything that was said yesterday about how the whole school ethos matters, I think it's clear we have a problem. She claims it's not external because she's got good teachers. Well, fantastic if she's got good teachers, because we know that's not always the case. But she hasn't thought at all about what messaging the children in her school are receiving, what she, as head of a school like that, could do to change the ethos in the school. The problem is not that girls don't like hard maths, not that girls can't do hard maths, but they are messaged that they shouldn't like maths. And, that it isn't cool to be a girl doing well in maths and all that kind of thing. And, of course, maths is a gateway to so many of the STEM disciplines, including biology these days. So I think the inquiry was pretty appalled by this. I mean, it got a lot of publicity. And my impression, I can't prove this, my impression is they decided to convene an extra session to which I was invited to present, amongst others, people who could come from the Institute of Physics, for instance, and present the counter-arguments, if you like. And this was the clip that the House of Commons itself put out. The other one I took off parliamentary TV, which was my interview there. The fact that most of the images one sees of scientists, physicists, are white males, I think is relevant. And this starts, really young, that the sort of message that society gives is that they are white males. And I think there is evidence to show that if you are black or if you're a woman, you don't see yourself fitting in. And I think some of the problems we see at later years are because girls, ethnic minorities, some ethnic minorities, not all, have already thought, I don't belong, I don't fit in. The fact that the national curriculum has no women scientists named, for instance, is pretty damning. And I think that this idea of, is this for me, we should really be looking at much earlier years than just the decisions made at 14 or 16, because they will subliminally have been made much earlier. I should correct one thing I said there. Apparently, Mary Anning is in the national curriculum, so there's one woman. But if you look at textbooks, so the reason I've got this scrappy piece of paper, some statistics from the American Chemical Society looking at standard chemistry textbooks. 30% of images were of women, 70% of men, but perhaps more to the point, 3% of the STEM professionals named in the index were women. 3%. There was a man's name mentioned on every 1 in 4 pages, and for women, it was 1 in 250. So, the kinds of books that children will pick up, the images they see, and the messaging they are receiving are all quite damaging. So, just mentioned yesterday about the Institute of Physics work. here, this is some data from the report. She mentioned closing doors. And looking at the percentage of boys and girls taking different A-level subjects. Girls, physics, about 20%. Psychology, heading for 80%. So we see how sort of classic stereotyping has impacted on both boys and girls. And I think it, you know, we don't talk so much about boys not doing languages, and I think we should, because it's part of the same problem, the way we bring up our children. And I think schools, and Institute of Physics has shown this by working with the whole school. So you don't have an English teacher saying boys can't do English. And you don't have what was the example given yesterday of an electronics lesson where the teacher didn't ask any of the girls in the class if they wanted to do electronics A-level. We have this problem in our schools. And one of my frustrations about the way my book has been received, it was published in May, is I don't think it's reaching teachers, and I really, really wanted it to reach teachers, because I think, I suspect their training does not particularly talk about these things, doesn't particularly focus on gender as an issue, and yet that is where so much could be changed. So Jess also mentioned the fact that if you go to a single-sex school, you are more than twice as likely to progress to physics A-level as a girl than if you go to a co-ed school. So is it the teachers, is it the peer group, or is it actually the parents who choose to send their daughters to single-sex schools who are having the influence? Can't tell from a graph like that, but it's certainly something that's worth thinking about, and I know so many female scientists much later in their professions who went to single-sex school, as did I. So much for early years. I now want to move on to what happens when you go to university and what can universities do. So this is data, this is American data, but it wouldn't be that different in this country, looking at the proportions, the percentages of women in different STEM disciplines. One of the most depressing things is if you look at computer science, so this curve, it's actually decreased quite substantially. Initially, computing was thought of as suitable for women. There's a really rather scary book called Programmed Inequality, which talks about how, as people recognized the importance of computing, if you like, it became a male-dominated field, which it wasn't when it started out. It was seen as quasi-clerical. In the other subjects, you can see biology is over 50%. Physics is sort of around the 20% and has been for donkey's years. Maths, there are indeed improvements in. So we have different imbalances in the different science disciplines. But if you look later on, the effect is the same in practically all of them, that the numbers of women drop off. So on the far side, you can see that this is global percentages of people at different grades, so starting from bachelor's and going up to post-PhD, number of women plummet. This data, which is American data again, looks at the higher ranks of academia, specifically in biology. Biology, it starts off with a majority of women, remember, and then it falls off. By the time you get to professorial rank, it's not much better than in physics, where the numbers started much lower. So different disciplines have different problems. The fall-off happens at different stages. It is said of physics, you have to be so determined as a woman to study it at all that you are more likely to persist, whereas biology, where you may be encouraged to do it, and you then find reality later on, and that's when the numbers drop off. But there's some other interesting factors, and I'd like to compare two studies. It's not proof, it is correlation, not necessarily causation. But this graph shows for both arts and humanities subjects and the sciences how brilliant people think you have to be to do it. So it's some measure of brilliance that people perceive these subjects to be. And in the art subjects, it's philosophy and economics, which you seem to have to be brilliant to do. And there aren't many women. In the science subjects, maths, physics, computer science, engineering, all associated with brilliance, and the numbers of women are very low. But what I find really scary is a study, a small study, admittedly, done looking at the perceptions of children at really young ages. At 5, boys and girls think boys and girls are equally smart. They don't use the word brilliant, they use the word smart. By the age of 6 or 7, girls have already decided that boys are smarter than them. What happens? What happens to our young girls that they receive that message that boys are smarter? What is going on at home, in the media, and in the classroom? And I find that quite scary, because if at 6 a girl thinks you have to be really smart, sorry, if at 6 you think the boys are smarter than you, and if at 16 you think you have to be really, really smart to do physics, you know, it's fairly obvious what's going to happen. You might think that universities believe in objective metrics, and in many ways they do. The trouble is, how objective really are the metrics that are used, for instance, for promotion? The evidence shows women typically get smaller grants. The success rates by now are pretty much equal. They used not to be. They are by now. The fact that papers take longer to reach publication. I mean, this is a curious one. So I was talking to a friend from the chemistry department here, and we wrote an article about our suspicions, if you like, that women's papers took longer to reach publication. And the Royal Society of Chemistry, perhaps for other reasons as well, but certainly in part prompted by that, did an analysis of their own journals. And they found it was true. They wrote a report about this, showing that at every stage, women were marginally disadvantaged. And all these little minor disadvantages add up. They are cited less often, perhaps because they're less likely to go to conferences and meet people. Who knows? They tend not to collaborate with other women, which seems to be a gatekeeper effect. If you think that the man in your department is more likely to control your future, maybe you will collaborate with him rather than another woman. Letters of reference are well known to be highly gendered. That the idea that a girl is a good team player or a woman is a good team player, but a man is brilliant. These sort of comments, you may think your female postdoc is brilliant, but you may not say it because of our unconscious bias. And double standards may apply, so that I have seen panels where 2 people are compared. For instance, this woman has patents to her name. Oh, has she made any money? Have these patents been picked up? And sort of half an hour later, a man with patents is considered, oh, look, he's got patents. No further questions. And I saw that happen, and one of the men on the panel said, hey, you know, we're using double standards here. We cannot do this. But it's quite hard to spot some of these things. They're quite subtle. Now, scientists like control experiments, and you might think a control experiment is quite difficult to do. And I only have one data point, but this is Barbara and Ben. And Barbara became Ben. Barbara transitioned at the age of about 40, and he suddenly was regarded very differently. So this is Ben Barras, as he was when he died. Shortly after I changed sex, a faculty member was heard to say, Ben Barras gave a great seminar today, but then his work is much better than his sister's. Now, you know, we're not going to get many data points like that, but it is kind of damning. And he himself became a great champion for diversity on the back of that. One of the things that frustrates me is there's an awful lot of male by default expectations. We heard from Jocelyn about putting, you know, if you're asking people to identify whether they're male or female, you put the M first, so it's not in alphabetical order. I've never worried about that. One of the things that I get really cross about is you've got a list of committee members, and they put an F against the women. I mean, it's the same thing. Somehow the woman is the freak. You have to pick her out. I'm not sure if this university still does it. I made a complaint about it, and that's where the phrase, oh, we're assuming male by default came from, actually, because it was the head of HR about 10 years ago who said that to me. So there are those kinds of things. The issue about appellations, where the woman is called Jane Smith and the man is called Professor Joe Smith, happens all the time. But there are other kinds of assumptions that the woman is the caregiver. Can't tell you how cross my daughter gets when the nursery will ring her, despite the fact it's her husband who is down as the first name contact, because he's the part-time worker. That a woman's returner cannot be serious about their career, that the career structures that we've always had is the only way to go, that 24/7 culture is important. All these things make a lot of sort of assumptions, implications about how careers should go and what an ideal employer should look like. And so we heard yesterday a bit about collaboration, and I think this is a very interesting one. We do still live in the world of the expectation of the lone male genius. The fact that most science these days, engineering, Herton was very clear about that yesterday, is about teamwork and collaboration. We don't value those things enough, particularly when it comes to things like promotion and recruitment. But there are other quite nasty things that go on, which sometimes relate to power imbalance. Bullying and harassment is alive and well in our universities. There's absolutely no doubt about that. If you're doing a PhD, you are really dependent on your supervisor, often a sort of single point of contact. And if that goes wrong, it can be really difficult to extricate yourself. It's very hard to say to the supervisor, I don't like the way you're treating me, because they're going to write your letter of reference. I was talking to a woman who'd spent a long time senior leader in a large multinational who said industry really doesn't have this problem, that where problems arise, it is dealt with. Universities are awful at this, and I don't know what can be done. It's often sort of the person who does the bullying often brings in large sums of grant money, and the university may feel that's more important than protecting the students. I don't know. This is a sort of image of what the world looks like for many people from the National Academies of Science. I don't know how easy it is to read, but they're really overt sort of groping and all the rest of it, sexual attack, that is perhaps more visible, but there's a lot more below the waterline that goes on. Sort of sexist insults expressed in a casual way, but persistently, sabotage of women's equipment. I mean, there are all kinds of things that can go on, not necessarily by the supervisor, sometimes by other group members, and very often little is done about it. And that, I think, contributes a lot to the way women drop out, because there comes a point when you think, I just can't face this anymore. And that's where bystanders can be so important. They may be male, they don't have to be, but certainly men have a huge role to play here, because it is often easier for someone else to speak up for the victim. If bad behavior is seen, then it should be called out. It can be difficult to do that. It can feel very threatening. But at the very least, you can check if the victim is okay. That's the least you can do. And you know, this applies in any walk of life. There's nothing special about STEM there. Low-level aggression and a toxic atmosphere will impact on everyone. And you know, some people may think, oh, that's the way to behave to get on, and then persist this kind of atmosphere. Very damaging. But Murray Edwards, when Barbara was here, set up a whole program of work about working with men. This is a quote from one of those reports. The most difficult challenge their alumni have faced in their careers is the non-supportive culture of their workplaces. Very often people say, it's because women want to have families. Men don't want to have families. Not convinced about that. But it's very easy to say the problem is women want to have it all, and you know, as if men didn't. But in fact, often it is the atmosphere in which women find themselves that puts them off. Senior management is often unaware of some of these issues, and it's vital to find allies and work with them to effect change. Women cannot do it all on their own, and nor should they. It should not be work for the women to try and solve the problems. But men speaking up, amplifying, calling out inappropriate behaviour, so important to try to change the atmospheres. So my own experience, I've had attacks on my science. I did a lot of work, for instance, on food physics. That was called domestic science. Both, yeah, you think it's funny. It's not. I had a whole series of interviews on local radio, and you know, you're only doing it because you're a woman. That I turn up somewhere and people say, oh, I wasn't expecting a woman. It's just so annoying. The assumption that I'm part of the Secretariat, one of the first times I sat on a Research Council funding committee, someone came up to me and said, papers came out very late, and I thought, hey? And then realized they assumed that I was part of the Secretariat. Comments on my dress in student evaluations. I don't suppose men get those. And actual sexual harassment. But some men have been incredibly important in my life as mentors and sponsors of me. And so it absolutely isn't all men. But we have problems. So all of that's really been about the individual. But we have problems in a society and the science that gets done. the sort of classic example, going back quite a long way, was the kind of crash dummy used in car crash simulations. It was a standard US male. I can't remember, he was taller than the average woman, heavier than the average woman, let's just put it that way. And they were looking for the effectiveness of seatbelts. And in fact, they ignored the fact that for pregnant women in particular, a seatbelt across a pregnant woman was the commonest cause of fetal death. And they just ignored that because they were used to dealing with a standard male. It affects drug dosages. And so a company can do an awful lot of work, invest millions and millions, putting a drug on the market, and then find the side effects on women are intolerable. And that's a lot of wasted money for that company if they have to pull the drug. I talked to Gina Rippon yesterday, who's written a book about the brain science, the gendered brain, whether or not there is gendering in the brain at birth. She's been looking at concussion, and concussion currently is mainly talked about in the context of elite sports, and I'm sure it's very important there. But for women, the commonest source of concussion is domestic abuse, and that doesn't get much mention, and women actually present concussion slightly differently. And of course, this is true about heart attacks and things too. Men and women aren't identical in their sort of the way they present medically. So if companies don't think about these issues, they may waste a huge amount of money. And if they have a properly diverse and inclusive workforce, and I haven't mentioned race effects here, but obviously ethnic backgrounds may have a huge effect too. As long as our STEM workforce is overwhelmingly white male, we have a problem. But it's also, and I think it was Hayden who mentioned yesterday about the importance of diversity on company boards, but it also comes to the research you do. Diverse teams do better because people are approaching problems from lots and lots of different directions. Underrepresented, so this is a PNAS paper. Underrepresented groups produce higher rates of scientific novelty, but their contributions are devalued and discounted. So obviously that has effect on them as individuals. They are less likely to get promoted if they don't have the citations, but it also means we are losing a lot of innovation. And if we are worrying about productivity, as we are in this country, what are we losing by not having a properly diverse workforce? The world is facing these huge existential problems, but we are not using all the talent we have. So it isn't just about the individual scientist, it is absolutely about our society. What are we losing by not having properly diverse teams? Now let me come back to Barbie. Here Mattel tried to create a series of different Barbies who were perhaps better role models. So this, if you don't recognize her, is Sarah Gilbert, so instrumental in the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine. And it's a more realistic kind of figure. It's not pink, which is good. And I think they had one of Maggie Adder in Pocock too. I don't have a picture of her. But they were trying, and I'm not aware of any downsides on this, except they're really hard to get hold of. I think they were a kind of limited edition. So you can't actually get one for your daughter or your granddaughter. So let me finish off. We still live in a society where the stereotypical image dominates, and we need to change that. It matters. We are leaving women out of the workforce. We are not solving the problems in the way we need to. We are not able to innovate appropriately. And I believe the problems start right from birth, really. So what we need is a complete change of culture, not asking for much there. But we need to change the way society expects boys and girls to behave. And I believe everyone has a part to play. And I will leave you, while we go on to the Q&A, I will leave you with a list that I produced a number of years ago now about what everyone can do. This was in The Guardian. And it's got something for everyone. So it's not just for the scientists to take this on. It is for the teachers, it is for the parents, and it's certainly for the men. I'm sure you can find something on that list you can do. And I will stop at that point and move on to Q&A.
Right, I want to thank you for your talk. It was just really amazing. And we really love your book. We have so many questions, so little time. But I wanted to start by asking, you talk about the importance of early years. What do you think is the relative importance of teachers, parents and media in shaping how young girls feel?
I've no idea. But I think they can all play a part. And, you know, if you have a teacher who's really supportive, then maybe that will help you to ignore the messages you're receiving in the media, for instance. So I think they all have a part to play. And, you know, every individual's experience, you'll have people in this audience who say, my parents were so supportive, I had this fantastic teacher. I'm not sure you'll see many or find many who will say, oh, I saw this wonderful story in the media, because I fear that doesn't happen enough.
So is it sort of a combination of...
I'm sure it's a combination, yeah.
I'm interested in how... Thank you for the talk, by the way. You talked about the effect of like single-sex schools, and I'm interested in like in respect to a women's space in higher education, like Murray Edwards or Newnham College. Do you think that they are more effective at supporting like a woman's progression into career, or do you think it's perhaps counterproductive to separate by gender at that level? I don't know, and I think it depends a lot on the individual. Mm-hmm. I mean, I went to Girton when it was all women, before there were any mixed colleges at all, so I had no choice about going to a mixed college. And I certainly appreciated being able to go back in the evening and be surrounded by women. I find that good. On the other hand, that's not what the real world is like. So, you know, it's a challenge. I'm also very conscious, and I hope Dorothy's not going to hate me for saying this, but I'm very conscious that there are no all-male colleges. And, you know, do we want to say that women are unable to cope in the mixed world? And so there is some strange messaging there. Mm-hmm. But I think for individuals, it may be really, really helpful, because, you know, if you're in a minority, if you're the only person in a lab class, it can get very wearing.
Thank you. Something I found really interesting when I read your book is, it was mentioned in your talk as well, the brilliance factor. Do you know why some subjects are considered more brilliant than others?
I mean, again, I guess that's cultural. I mean, philosophers, for instance, have always been accorded sort of great respect ever since classical times. Yeah, no, I think it's just a long, long history of what is seen as. I'm sure maths comes into it, in the sense that the number of people, politicians, for instance, who say, "Oh, I never could do maths," and that is such a damaging message. The idea that it's all right not to do maths, whereas if I stood up and said, "Well, I've never read a Shakespeare play," I would be absolutely, you know. So there is this distinction, and I think maths sits at the heart of some of it. And I think, yeah, we need to change that, because I personally feel, well, I can't do languages. I can't speak any other language. I can read French and German. I can't speak them. So I find that really, really difficult. But to other people, it comes utterly naturally. So, you know, there is no absolute there, I think.
Do you have hope that we can change that and say these subjects, like biology, is not lesser than physics?
Well, I think it would be good if we didn't have head teachers saying girls don't like hard maths. I think that would be a good place to start.
Yeah, following on from that, and also from the discussion we had yesterday, kind of around the need to be excellent, and the discussion around role models. So in your book, and you briefly touched on it today, you say that you don't think Marie Curie is a plausible role model for young girls. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about who you do deem to be a good role model, and also in your personal experience, like who were the role models you had and looked up to in different points of your career?
So I didn't really have role models as such, partly because there weren't many out there. I think, to me, it was much more, first of all, it was books that were important to me rather than role models when I was at school. But I think thereafter it was individuals who, you know, absolutely aren't household names, but they were the ones who supported me, told me how to get through the maze that is academia. In terms of good role models, well, I mentioned Hannah Fry, and I mentioned her
or Helen Chesky, who's actually a Churchill alum, or Alice Roberts, they are very much more accessible. They're frequently on our TV screens. They are closer in age to teenagers growing up, and certainly Alice has children, Hannah has children. I don't think Helen does, but just having a normal life, which they talk about. I mean, Hannah's been incredibly frank about the cancer she had, for instance. So she's very, very human, and I think that is fantastic. That willingness to be open. Alice. So I've interviewed all three of them. You can find the interviews on the web. And, Alice was talking about how she did a lot of filming when her child at the time was sort of 6 weeks old, and how her husband came along and sort of took care during the filming sessions. I think all those things make it very accessible. And I think it's important not to think, as a teenager, that a scientist is some really, someone up there who you couldn't possibly identify with, and who perhaps doesn't really have a life, as it were. And I think these three women are all excellent at showing that you can be a person as well as a scientist.
Yeah, do you think the supervision and tutorial system that we have in Oxford and Cambridge is useful for that? Because I would say when I came, sitting in a supervision with someone who's this amazing academic, but then having that human connection is very reassuring for a young scientist. Do you think that's something we could implement in other universities, or even having this mentor system in schools perhaps would be helpful?
I think there are lots of ways of building connections and showing that science has a human face, as it were. I think your experience isn't universal. Some people, and I think we heard this yesterday, some people are very scared in a supervision, so it depends a lot on who your supervisor is. But I think trying to make it clear that if you read about Marie Curie, she had this extreme life where, she worked in a sort of shed or a basement, I can't remember. It was very, very cold, and, spent years trying to get this small amount of radium and stuff. I don't think that's a good message, because who wants to lead a life like that? And I think leading a life which shows that, science is fun and satisfying, and you can do it too, is a much more important message. And your supervisor may indeed say, this is what I did in the lab today, but they may not.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
There was something I came across in the book that really surprised me. I don't know if it should have, really. You mentioned studies showing that in less developed socioeconomically countries, the gender gap in STEM subjects is actually much lower. There's more female representation. And I wanted to hear your thoughts of that. Do you think as these countries develop more, then we're likely to see a greater gap forming? Or is this cultural? And can we take inspiration from that and see how they do things?
I think the answer is probably a bit of both. So I think it was Shahina mentioned yesterday about how in Iran there were more women in the study. I mean, she talked about 60% or something. I think the point is, in the developing world, is young children see STEM subjects in general as a way of improving their country and improving perhaps their own lives. Whereas in this country, and again, the media talk so much about footballers' wives and things, or celebrities in general, and much more messaging about having the right shaped body or whatever. And so I don't think there's the same aspiration here, because many people have very comfortable lives here compared with the less developed countries, the global south. And so I think there's less motivation for improvement to help the country here. Now, as those countries get more developed, I don't know. It would be nice to think they wouldn't follow the way of this country and the States and things and becoming materialistic, but who knows?
So do you think, as we saw with COVID and we saw the importance of science in that, do you think that helps this sort of thing? So it's emphasizing the importance of science, and we're not, obviously we've got a lot of issues with this country still, and do you think that helps?
I don't know. I mean, I think the way science was talked about so much in the news, Sarah Gilbert, whose Barbie I showed, you know, she was very much a face of the pandemic. It would be nice to think that that will have a positive impact. As I say, I really worry that the idea that science is unimportant when we're up against such huge problems is really damaging, because it encourages the idea that you know, conspiracy theories, that the scientists are out to get us and they're implanting you know, chips in our arms when they vaccinate us and that kind of thing. And if you understand science a bit better, you might see just how daft some of these ideas are. But I don't know. I mean, because, I mean, the trouble with living in the Cambridge bubble is you don't meet people who believe these things very much. So you know, I can't understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, just dialing back to the discussion about the early years. You showed obviously the word bubbles that Jocelyn also had the same slide with these two kind of extremes of what we promote. And you mentioned that you also don't think the messages that we're promoting to young boys are very productive. How do you think we can like find a balance, and what do you think are the key kind of messages that we should be perhaps putting in toys for young children?
Yeah, I think, I don't really know. The trouble is that the toy companies want to market their toys. And that is why we have such distinctive toy, you know, choices, if you like. Lego has said they will not market toys specifically for boys and girls anymore, on the back of some studies. But that doesn't mean toy shops won't, and parents won't buy them. I mean, I think things like collaboration and, you know, what's the word I want? Innovation and things like that, you know, creativity, all these things which are so important. You know, unicorns really don't make much difference in our lives.
Thank you.
There's something that I think you briefly touched on, something about how we use different words to talk about women versus men. And I think in the book you referred to talking about job applications, but also job advertisements. And you said that we should look towards more using more gender neutral terms. And you mentioned like ambitious as an example, and you said ambitious was generally used to describe men, and therefore if women saw in the job description, they would be less likely to apply. But is that sort of contributing to the culture, saying that we should change the words we're using rather than trying to shift the meaning of them and how we use them?
I mean, again, it's slightly chicken and egg. And women are discouraged from being ambitious. So if they see that, they go, oh, that's not me. I mean, I'll give a specific example. I can't remember if I gave it in the book. So when UKRI, the overarching research council, was created, they wanted to create a board. And they put out an advertisement for board members, which was so macho, if you like. It was all about people who've led change and transformational and, you know, all the rest of it. And at the time I was sitting on a departmental diversity committee. It was for BEIS, as was Business, Energy, Industry and Skills. Can't remember what it stood for. And, you know, everyone was saying this advert is, you know, very macho. And somehow I ended up with having to write to the people who put the advert out and saying, not good enough. And they changed it. They did change it. They changed it to something that talked much more about people who could, you know, contribute to a team and to affect change, but not that they were, you know, necessarily got years of experience in change management. And, you know, before I wrote that letter of complaint, I talked to various women who were in the category who might have thought of applying, you know, Pro-Vice Chancellors, for instance. And they all said, no, I looked at that, I thought it was horrible. I mean, because it conveys the wrong kind of working. So I think we can move away from the idea that being aggressive is good, for instance. We can move away from the idea that the sort of classical male way of working is the only way. And I move to something where both men and women are converging on actually what we want in our workforce.
Makes sense.
I'm interested in. We spoke also again. Yes, sorry, come back to something that was touched on yesterday as well. But this idea that when maths becomes more about problem solving and less about finding the right answer, or like having a definitive answer, that girls get somewhat put off by that. And there is debate around whether the way that we assess STEM subjects, especially maths, is tailored towards male students. I just kind of wanted to pick your brain on that, of whether you think that's like natural thing or, yeah. How.
I mean, I suspect it comes back to how we teach, and this is not my area of expertise, because everyone has to be able to problem solve. So I was quite concerned by that. But, I mean, I don't know if Val's here today, but Val and Lisa Jardine Wright did some work about how physics undergraduate questions are posed, and they set, in sort of mock tests, rival sets of questions where they were more or less structured, and structuring the questions really helped the girls. But it's about confidence, I think. And, we heard a lot about confidence yesterday. So if girls gain the confidence that they can problem solve, then they won't be put off by problem solving. We cannot move away from expecting mathematicians to problem solve. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a question of helping all students understand how to decode a question that may be not just written out in mathematical terms, mm-hmm. And to give them the confidence they can do it, and that should help everyone, I think.
Okay, thank you.
I think it might be time to open the questions from the audience.
Sounds good. If you have any questions, then feel free to raise your hand and someone will bring a mic to you.
Good morning. Fantastic talk. But you're singing to the choir. We're all self-selected to be here. You said we should try to change the culture. I think that's men and women. How do we get more men to self-select to sit in this audience, to look at these slides, to hear what you're saying, and to realize what unconscious bias is?
Well, as I say, it's gone. My last slide. Can we go back to my last slide? Thank you. That was absolutely directed. I mean, as I say, it went into the Guardian, I think it was the Guardian Science blog some years ago, absolutely about what everyone can do. Because, as I say, I'm frustrated. My book has not been reviewed in any mainstream newspaper. It's been reviewed in Nature and Physics World, Physics World, that's right, and places like that. You're absolutely right. We're talking to the choir, which is why I want to reach teachers, because I actually think they're really important. And later years, yes, the men need to think about what is being allowed to persist in their department or in their research group. On the whole, I find men quite receptive. If I go and talk in a university department, it will typically be more men than women. And, I have to hope that the 30-year-old men get it in a way that perhaps my generation didn't. But on there I've put everyone should demand unconscious bias training to be made mandatory. I'm no longer convinced that's such a good thing, because there is evidence that shows that people can do these sort of online things and think they've got it. They don't have to think about it. And that's absolutely not what it should be about. It should be about discussion. It should be about thinking about these things. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's really nice to talk to a lot of people who get it, but it's not the audience that needs to hear it.
Hi, thank you very much. Something that takes my sleep away. We all believe here that this is the right thing to do, and that empowering women is the right thing to do. But there are opponents, and sometimes quite vocal opponents of that ideology. And if it were the dinosaurs of the old age that's, we would just wait for them to go extinct. But what's alarming is there's quite a big share of young men starting to think that. The rise of ideology like this, I come from Poland, and over there, there's a party getting time in the media, social media and mainstream media, telling that they believe young women are upset because they're made to work and they would be happier as stay-at-home moms, contradicting every research. And just a quote I've seen in a comment section on LinkedIn yesterday from Mr. Edward Thiele, Chairman and CEO of Worldwide Industries Capital. I don't know what that is, but he's clearly making himself very important, saying that girl power and every harmful ideology on the books have succeeded in collapsing 90% of large democracies, turning half of the world in direct opposition to the West, and lose 4 to 30 billion daily. How do we talk to these people? How we prevent this from growing?
I mean, there are men who feel threatened, undoubtedly. I'd not heard that particular viewpoint before. I mean, there are men who think that women are taking away their jobs, undoubtedly. And ultimately, in some sense, that's true, because, a finite number of jobs, if more women get jobs, fewer men get jobs. But I think it was Camilla Cavendish in the FT who said, we'll know we've reached equality when mediocre women get jobs at just the same rate as mediocre men. I mean, that viewpoint, it sounds really, really extreme. I have not heard it, and I'm not sure I can respond very...
Comfortable speaking about it on the mainstream media, it's public comment sections.
Yeah.
And he's getting likes from other people, so clearly...
There are some very unpleasant men out there, undoubtedly. And all, I come again, journalists, any journalists in the room, please, don't perpetuate these ideas that having women present is inimical to profits, for instance, because it's just rubbish and the evidence is not supporting that.
Hi, my name is Uma and I'm from Robbery School for Girls in East London. Our school promotes STEM subjects and take-up in A-levels is high, but my question is how we are really supported in our school, but my worry is that how can we ensure young women are supported in higher education and in the workplace?
Well, I think, again, that comes back to some of this. Everyone has a responsibility to call out bad behaviour. And it's not always easy to do. But I think, more importantly, people should look at individuals in higher education or in the workplace as people. Whether they're male or female or anything in between shouldn't really be so relevant. They bring whatever skills they bring. And I think managers... The more one talks about unconscious bias in that sense, I don't mean doing unconscious bias training, but don't just go for someone who looks like you. I think that message has to be said over and over again. I have been fantastically lucky in men who have mentored me and sort of supported me regardless of the fact I was a woman. So to give you a specific example, some of you in the room may remember Sam Edwards, who was... he ran a research council. He was head of the Cavendish for a while. And when would he have been born? He'd have been born in about 1925. And when I was thinking about having a family and I was wanting to apply for a lectureship in the department, I went to him and said, I want to have a family. And he said intelligent women should have children. And it was such so far ahead of his time in that sense, because he could have said, well, don't bother to apply then. People like that can make so much difference. If you find someone like that, latch onto them, ask them for advice, male or female, because people like that who will support you through difficult times, really, really important.
Hey, thank you so much for the talk. It was really insightful. I want to especially deal around the point of collaboration versus being kind of competitive and trying to advance one's agenda. I guess the question is, how, as women, can we progress in our careers without becoming more conformant to kind of competitive alpha culture? And how can we essentially create a culture around us of collaboration and cooperation without, well, not being in power yet?
I think you have to do science, live your life the way that you are comfortable with. And I think there is no doubt that trying to put on an act will ultimately have a cost. And I'm conscious, you know, there was a point in my life when I tried to pretend I was one of the boys down the pub kind of thing. And I look back at it and think, why did I do that? And, you know, you do it because you want to be included. And sometimes, you know, we're all chameleons. We will all change to fit the circumstance. I think if collaboration is important to you, then that's what you should do, because that's the way you will do the best science. I think that society, universities don't yet recognise the importance of that enough, but I think as the nature of problems changes, it's going to become more and more important and more explicitly a problem. You're not going to solve climate change as a one-man group. So I hope we can change it. I think talk about it. I think so. This university produced a book called The Meaning of Success, and Barbara was certainly in it. I think Val was. I was sort of one of the moving forces behind it. And there were a lot of people who talked about, I mean, it was all about women and how they viewed success differently. And if you want to find it, I think it's available free on Amazon. Or maybe it's free on the university website, sorry. Lots of the women interviewed talked about how important collaboration was, how important looking after their students was. And I think that message, I think it is changing. I think people are recognising it more. But I think if you try and turn yourself into someone you're not, you will end up really miserable.
Thank you for the insightful and inspiring talk. I'm coming back to something you said about basically not being cool. Here we are in a room of high-achieving women, but I'm just wondering about a person that not necessarily is going into a STEM profession. And as a mathematician, I find people almost wearing as a badge of honor to tell me that math was the worst topic for them in school, and there is this perpetuating belief that it's, you know, it's almost cool not to be engaging in STEM. And I think you said something about democracy as well and understanding the big challenges. So even if someone doesn't do STEM in the university, it's very important that they do it at a good level so that they can understand later on in life how other people are discussing topics. So can you elaborate a bit on these ideas about the overall society and coolness and...
Yeah, I mean, again, I demand cultural change in our society. It'll be difficult. It's interesting, you know, Rishi Sunak's call for everyone to do maths and English to 18, in many senses, is a wonderful idea, and the Royal Society has been calling for that kind of thing for years. The fact there are no teachers to do it is a minor detail. But I think we do have to change. You know, and the quote I gave you from Christine O'Done, I mean, it's just so depressing. We need scientists to go into all walks of life so that they can write the policies, they can write the articles in the newspapers, and put the counter view. I mean, the reality is most journalists do not have STEM backgrounds. Most politicians do not have STEM backgrounds. Chi is unusual in coming from an engineering, you know, from being a professional engineer, not just doing engineering at university. And I think, I mean, that is not a gender issue in particular. It is a societal one. It isn't true in every society. You know, there is something really odd about the UK in that respect. It's quite unusual. The Chinese political leadership, whatever you think about it, has historically had a large number of engineers in it, for instance. So it is something about this country. I blame our class system for this. I mean, my personal view is that subjects like, if you read Matthew Arnold, who was a very influential educator in 1870s or something, and he thought we should just hark back to classical education, that learning Latin and Greek was the most important thing. Well, no one would say that now, not even Mary Beard, I suspect. So, you know, what can we do to change what is really important? But I think that legacy lives on. It lives on, you know, if you are good at STEM in a good school, like, and I don't mean Hills Road, I mean Eton or somewhere, you know, you are actually looked down on compared with those who play rugby. That's something very wrong in our value system. We are not still trying to solve colonial problems.
I think we have time for one last question.
I just wanted to pull out something you said in your talk. You said that 5 girls thought they were equally as brilliant as boys, and by 6 or 7 they thought they were less brilliant. Do you have any idea how or why in the span of 1 or 2 years girls can suddenly put themselves down?
No, it's a simple answer. I mean, whether... there was a very interesting programme, I think on the BBC, which unfortunately is not on iPlayer, which followed a teacher, a male teacher, in a class of 7-year-olds on the Isle of Wight. And it showed, to his horror, I mean, he was really brave. You know, they filmed him and then interviewed him and talked about what he'd been doing. That he was, the way he was interacting with his class was incredibly gendered. You know, one of the things I remember, he called all the girls Sweet Pea. And, you know, whether he gave the boys and girls the same toys, so, you know, jigsaws, for instance. I haven't talked about 3D thinking and spatial awareness, but if you give the boys that and the girls the Barbies, then, you know, the boys develop skills the girls don't. And so I suspect there's a lot of that probably in the home too, that they receive different messages. And if you are a girl who's used to playing with Barbie and you look at a boy doing some puzzle or, you know, playing on the tablet or whatever, and they can do something you can't, you will immediately assume that you're less smart. Now, there are ways, there are other things. I mean, the educators would say you need to develop a growth mindset, not a fixed mindset. So if you tell a girl who's done a maths test that you must be very smart, then when they get to the problem solving and they can't do it, they feel they're not very smart anymore. If you say to that girl, you must have worked really hard to be able to do that, then she will think that she can continue to work hard, and when she gets faced with something else, she will be able to do it. So I think there are messages that can be given and tricks that can be played, but that it happened so early, I was horrified by that.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Athene, for your talk. I think some really good insights have been brought out, and I hope everyone enjoyed it.